Ever wonder how societies work, without presidents or parliaments or even like those endless comment wars we see online?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Really makes you think about, well, how ingrained our own ideas about governance really are.
For sure. And that's what we're diving into today, how power works in cultures that are, well, pretty different from our own. We're talking political anthropology.
We're going to be looking at a lot of different ways humans have organized themselves. Everything from nomadic pastoralists to societies that are, really steeped in tradition.
Okay, so first up, the newer people of South Sudan. They've got these huge territories, herds of cattle, but no formal government.
Right, right.
Our sources say they rely on a system called segmentary opposition. Does that sound complicated? Because it kind of does.
Well, the name might sound a little intimidating, but it's actually pretty logical when you break it down. Think of it as like a series of alliances. But here's the thing. These alliances, they change depending on, how big the conflict is.
Okay.
So let's say you and your sibling are arguing, you're on opposite sides.
Makes sense.
But then a neighbor gets involved suddenly. You and your sibling are a team against that outsider. And then you can expand that to whole clans coming together against other clans and so on.
So in a way, conflict is like strengthening social bonds.
It's kind of like social physics in a way.
It is. But okay, how do they actually resolve these disputes? They don't have courts or written laws or anything like that, right?
Okay, so this is where the leopard skin chiefs come in.
Yep.
They're these respected mediators chosen for being neutral, and they rely more on social pressure than actual, formal authority.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so think of them like community-appointed negotiators, but with a much better dress code.
I love that. I love the image of a leopard skin mediator. That's amazing. But, relying on social pressure, that seems a little, I don't know, fragile. What happens if someone just ignores the chief?
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not a perfect system. There's a lot of pressure to listen to them, but there are always power dynamics at play. Wealth, someone's reputation, even just the size of their family that can all influence what happens.
That's true.
And, research shows that things like, the introduction of modern weapons, that's really changed things too. Made those traditional ways of resolving conflict a lot more complex.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that these systems aren't just, operating in isolation. There are always things influencing them, both from within and outside.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the newer, but now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about a totally different approach to power the Melanesian big men. Have you heard of them?
Oh, yeah. And then you've got the Polynesian chiefs. It's really interesting to compare them.
It is. It's like a study in contrasts. So for our listeners who haven't heard of big men, can you tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. In a lot of Melanesian societies, power isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn.
Okay.
You have to earn it.
So it's less about like your family and more about
Right.
what? Charisma? Or is it more like ambition?
Honestly, it's probably a bit of both. These big men, they gain influence by building these complex networks. They give gifts, they make strategic alliances, they're really generous, or at least they appear that way.
So it's like high stakes social networking.
Exactly. And their success really depends on how big and how strong those networks are.
It sounds exhausting. Always having to maintain these relationships, manage rivalries. I mean, is it even sustainable in the long term?
Well, that's the thing. It's inherently unstable, right? There's always the risk that a rival is going to come out on top or that your alliances will shift or honestly that you just miscalculated your resources. It's high risk, high reward.
That makes sense. And that's so different from, like you said, those Polynesian societies where it's a lot more structured.
Right. They have their hereditary chiefs and sometimes even kings.
It's a little more familiar to us, I guess.
Yeah, it can seem that way.
Mhm.
They often have clearer hierarchies, systems of administration, and, enough resources to support that complexity. But don't be fooled into thinking they don't have their own struggles with power. They absolutely do.
Right, right. So I guess that leads us to a big question about power, no matter the culture. How is it tied to resources?
That's a theme we see again and again, isn't it? Whether it's land, money, even knowledge, having control over those things often translates to political influence. But as we'll see when we talk about the Swat Pathons, it's almost never straightforward.
The Swapathanes and their relationship with land. Now that's a story. It makes, like, Game of Thrones look like child's play, ready to jump back into it. Last time, we were talking about how different cultures handle power, right?
And how often that comes down to control over resources.
Exactly. And that brings us to the Swat Valley in Pakistan. The Pashtun people live there.
The Swat Pathans.
Yeah, the Swat Pathans.
Yeah.
And our sources say that for them, owning land is like the most important thing.
It's hugely important. And a small elite, the Pakhtuns from the Yusufzai clan, they own a huge amount of the land.
So from the get-go, there's this built-in inequality.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect, like, their politics?
Alliances. It's all about who you're allied with, but it's not always who you'd think.
What do you mean?
Well, when a Pashtun man wants more land, he doesn't necessarily work with his close family.
Really? You'd think family would be the most reliable.
You'd think so, but not with their inheritance system. All sons inherit the same amount.
Ah, I see.
So a Pashtun man's biggest rivals are often his own brothers.
Wow. So it's the enemy of my enemy.
Exactly. They're more likely to make alliances with relatives who are further away, whose land is somewhere else. It creates this really complex web of allegiances. It all comes down to ambition in a system where land equals power.
But it's more than just the land, isn't it? There's something else they need.
Oh, yeah. Clients.
Clients.
Having a lot of people who depend on you to work the land, provide support, even fight for you if they have to, that's essential for any Pashtun who wants real influence.
So it's like a cycle. Land is power, but to get land, you need more people. But to get more people, you need power.
Exactly. And it keeps those in power at the top.
It doesn't leave a lot of room for, anyone else to get ahead. So can a society like that, with such big differences in power, can it actually survive for a long time?
It's a good question, especially with all the modern pressures and changes happening.
And there are a lot of those.
The research shows that the Swat Pathans have dealt with a lot of problems: political instability, the rise of religious militancy.
So they're not immune to what's happening in the wider world.
Not at all.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit again. I want to talk about the role of the state. The government. Our sources describe it as this kind of detached thing, like a balloon floating above society.
It's a powerful image. It really gets at how complex the relationship is between, the people in charge and the people they're supposed to be in charge of.
Totally. They talk about Congo as an example. Instead of getting money from taxes and its own citizens, the state there is separate. It gets funded by foreign aid and, using up its own resources.
It's something we see a lot, sadly. And it makes you question, legitimacy, accountability. If a government isn't answerable to the people it governs, then who are they really working for?
That's a scary thought. What happens when the people in power don't even need the support of their citizens anymore?
It's definitely something to think about. But even in places where the state feels very distant, people find ways to navigate power.
Right, they create their own systems.
Exactly. The research talks about how even in a place like Congo, where people feel ignored by their government, they don't just give up. They turn to other sources of power, traditional healers, religious leaders.
It's resilience.
Absolutely. People need to make sense of the world, even when it seems chaotic.
And speaking of chaos, we've been talking about power, but we can't ignore the dark side of it. It's a heavy topic, but it's there, right?
Yeah.
The potential for violence.
Yeah.
You can't talk about power without talking about that.
It's true, and our sources, they explore it from a lot of different angles. The troubles in Northern Ireland, the Rwandan genocide. There's even stuff in there about, the role anthropologists themselves have played in conflict zones.
This isn't just, an academic thing. We're talking about real people and what they went through.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this one source that really got to me, actually. It's about these paramilitaries during the Troubles. It talks about how they were basically conditioned to use violence, how it became part of their whole way of being, their language, how they thought, even how they saw their own bodies.
It's kind of hard to imagine, violence just being everyday life. How does that even happen?
Well, they talk about the euphemisms they used for killing, for one thing. They were trying to make it, cleaner than it really was. Mm-hmm. And then there's this whole other aspect where the book looks at how prisoners, even though they lost their freedom, they still tried to have some control, through their bodies, with hunger strikes or refusing to wear the prison uniform.
Sounds like acts of defiance against the system that's trying to control them.
Exactly. Their bodies became these tools of resistance, and it shows how violence can be really personal, really symbolic, even when it's happening on this huge national scale.
Right.
And speaking of which, when you look at something like the Rwandan genocide or the conflict in Sri Lanka, these awful events, they show how easy it is for violence to just explode.
And it's often driven by, social divisions that were already there.
A lot of the time, yeah. Our sources talk about propaganda, about how they twist history, make the other side seem like monsters.
And that makes it okay to do horrible things.
Exactly. And it shows how strong ideology can be, how fear and hatred can be used to get people to commit violence on a massive scale.
You know, this makes you wonder when we talk about things like civil war or genocide. Are
Yeah.
they even in the same category? Where's the line?
That's something anthropologists are always debating, actually. The scale is different, the context is different, but our sources suggest that there are these unsettling similarities, like how violence becomes normal, even something to celebrate within a certain group.
And that's where understanding those patterns, listening to people's stories, it's so important.
It's crucial, but, and some of the sources point this out, it can be risky too. Anthropologists who work in these places, they have a responsibility to protect the people they talk to think about how their research might be used. It's a tough line to walk.
That's a lot to consider. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our deep dive here. What should our listeners take away from all of this? These examples, they're pretty diverse, pretty challenging.
Well, if nothing else, I hope it's given everyone a new perspective. Think about it, the ways we form societies, how we go after power, how we deal with conflict. It's been happening forever, really, constantly changing, playing out in every culture.
It's true. From those leopard skin chiefs we talked about to the SWAT Pathans and their alliances, the question is still the same, isn't it? How do we make societies that are fair and stable? Societies where power, however it exists, is acknowledged, but also, challenged and hopefully used for good.
Yeah, there's something to think about.
Definitely. We'll leave everyone with that. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and never stop looking for new perspectives. It's how we learn about ourselves and this whole thing we call humanity.